I wanted to spend the time that we have together really talking about the taxonomy of carbon capture and how I think about what this actually is for. And to kind of Maggie's point, I think that there are some real questions out there still about what does it look like to really think about this in the context of taking appropriate climate action while also recognizing that there are a lot of bad ways we could do this essentially. And so that's kind of what I hope to talk about today. But yeah, so I think just starting out to kind of frame where I'm coming from with this and to use a few terms that I'm going to use a lot. I'm sure people are already familiar with this, but just to kind of give you my take on it and how I'm using it. When we think about climate action, there's multiple functions associated with that climate action that have atmospheric impacts. And specifically, when we're talking about carbon management and carbon capture, specifically carbon capture and storage, things like that, there are a couple different atmospheric functions that might serve, and they have really, really different roles. So emissions mitigation is the one that I think we traditionally have thought about in the context of climate action, where you're preventing an emission from reaching the atmosphere that would have otherwise gone there. This is things like reducing emissions from power plants, whether that's by replacing the fuel, putting carbon capture on the plant, that sort of thing. But then there's kind of this new role for a conversation around emissions removal. Carbon dioxide removal, CDR, is often how we think about this, but the idea is essentially if we can take CO2 that's already in the atmosphere back out of the atmosphere, that has some potential important implications for what overall climate response looks like. The chart on the right here is essentially showing kind of an IPCC sense of where global greenhouse gas emissions need to be over time in order to keep us to 1.5 degrees Celsius or below. We're already at about 1.2 or 1.3 relative to pre-industrial conditions. And then the lines are essentially in this chart showing what country pledges look like and making the point that those are not anywhere near. But the thing that I want to draw your attention to is that green shaded bar that essentially suggests that global greenhouse gas emissions need to be negative kind of by mid-century or a little bit afterwards in order to keep this below 1.5 degrees Celsius range. That's something that's been shown in a number of different models. It doesn't mean that it's definitely necessarily true, but we are starting to get into an environment where we have contributed so much greenhouse gas to the atmosphere that there is an expectation that we're actually going to need to pull some of it back out in order to keep the climate to the global targets that we're setting for ourselves. That looks really different from mitigation and is part of the reason why there's so much interest in direct air capture and a bunch of other carbon dioxide removal activities. But, and I will get into this a little bit more over the next few minutes, but that's a really different atmospheric function than mitigation, which is, again, more about keeping pollution out of the atmosphere in the first place. Most people that look at this agree that you cannot do removal until you've really solved your mitigation problem. You need to do mitigation first. The notion of getting to negative emissions actually suggests that you've actually eliminated all positive emissions by then. So this is a both and kind of thing, but both very significant tasks and pretty different functionally. So within that context, I think one of the things that is challenging from a language perspective is that people tend to talk about carbon dioxide removal and kind of mean DAC relative to CCS and mean mitigative point source CCS. But that's kind of comparing a function with a technology class. So where I was just talking about mitigation and removal being climate action functions, carbon capture is a class of technologies. Some carbon capture performs a mitigative function, some carbon capture performs a removal function, and I don't think that where we've kind of landed with referring to CCS and CDR as two separate things is all that helpful, because you can have CCS that is CDR, you can have CDR that's not CCS, like all those kinds of things. But it's basically, it's an apple and oranges comparison where you're comparing a technology class to what it's actually doing. And I think that this kind of belies the overall sense that I have that when we talk about carbon capture, there is a little bit of a tendency to focus on a project rather than what it's actually doing. And I think that that's not particularly helpful. So overall point being, carbon capture can be used for either mitigation or removal. I also put this something else in there because sometimes you can do carbon capture and not mitigate and not remove. So for example, there's some discussion of using carbon capture to find CO2 that then you turn into products. If that's not displacing something else, maybe you're just kind of using it and not necessarily doing mitigation or removal. It's a little more complicated and not something we're observing yet, but it's possible that carbon capture is not actually achieving either of these functions. But carbon capture is capable of mitigation, it's capable of removal depending on how you apply it. Not all mitigation is carbon capture. So some emissions mitigation that we see is fuel switching, closing a coal plant, replacing it with wind. Not all carbon dioxide removal is carbon capture either. So if you think about some removal pathways that involve biological sinks, for example, so forestation, something like that, there's challenges associated with permanence and all of those good things, but not all CDR is carbon capture. But on the flip side, not all carbon capture is mitigation, not all carbon capture is removal. This is kind of a set of things that can be applied toward an end, but it depends on what you're actually doing before you can make that declaration of what's really going on. So the point is, it actually does matter what carbon capture is for. And this is kind of where I get into thinking about why do we care about what it's for? What does it mean if it's for one function versus another? And then how do we declare those functions in kind of an overarching taxonomy? So when we think about why it matters, what carbon capture is for, one of the big questions is what are the benefits? It's hard to say what you're achieving by doing carbon capture if we're not very clear about why. And one of the, I think, the big places that this shows up is that if you're watching some of these processes that are trying to do a lot of community engagement and so forth, those tend to focus quite a lot on the project and on fence line issues. That's reasonable, and those are important things to be paying attention to. But I think oftentimes we see projects going into community engagement without being very, very clear about what the project is actually achieving. So, you might feel differently about a particular fence line impact if the project is going toward increasing oil production than if it is actually restoring the climate. Like, these kinds of things actually do matter a lot when we think about trade-offs. So similarly, what are the harms? That's usually a little bit more clear without necessarily definitely knowing what the carbon capture is for in a direct sense, but really understanding why you're doing the carbon capture also helps you understand what would happen if you didn't. And so sometimes the harm of not doing something is that you're accepting additional climate change or something along those lines, but you need to understand what the project is actually doing before you can really evaluate all of that. And then finally, and this is related to both of those things, this question of what could be done instead is also really, really important as we think about the different types of carbon capture that are going on. So if you're saying I could put carbon capture onto a refinery, which is kind of debatable for technological reasons, in addition to cost reasons and things like that, or I could shut the refinery down, that's a really different conversation, particularly in the context of overall decarbonization, than maybe applying the same question to a carbon removal project that's purposed for drawdown. So I'm doing this to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. What could you do instead? The CO2 stays in the atmosphere. It's a very different conversation. And we're not there yet. You need to get to zero before you can get to negative. But these are the kinds of counterfactual scenarios that I think are also really important to evaluate. And this matters, like what the carbon capture is actually for, because it influences a bunch of different things. One being what people might actually be willing to tolerate. Obviously, we want to do the best we can with any project that gets built, whether that's transmission or big new renewable projects or a carbon dioxide removal project or some sort of mitigation project. But a lot of the time, what we see when talking to people about projects and community impacts, for a project where people really understand and agree with the purpose, we're often a little bit more willing to tolerate a period of construction noise or something like that. If there is really not a lot of support for what the project is actually for, like again, if you're putting CO2 capture on a big coal plant, allowing that coal plant to last longer than it would have otherwise, and then using that CO2 to produce more oil, a lot of the time people are going to be less interested in making sacrifices to enable that functionality. So really thinking about what's going on is pretty important. And I think this resonates a lot probably in the ethanol space based on what I've heard. This also is actually really important from a technology perspective, though. And I know Maggie gave up the bat signal for civil engineering talking about pipelines a little, so I'll nod to that for a second. But really thinking about what infrastructure is actually necessary for the project that you're looking at is another huge reason why this matters. So if you're doing CDR, carbon dioxide removal via direct air capture with storage, you don't necessarily need the same kinds of pipeline infrastructure that you would if you're mostly focusing on power plants where you have very specific fixed locations. So in that example, basically you can put a direct air capture plant somewhere new. These are all greenfield sites, essentially. Like you could hypothetically reuse a factory site or similar, but you can choose where you put it. And that means you can maybe choose to put it right next to a storage facility or something along those lines that you can't do with a power plant. So again, thinking about when we're looking at a bunch of these projections for how much pipeline infrastructure you need, a lot of the time you need pipeline infrastructure because you're trying to serve existing facilities and they're distant from these storage complexes. If you're talking about brand new facilities, which is more common for the carbon dioxide removal side of it, you maybe don't actually need that much support infrastructure because you can make better geographic choices earlier on. And then similarly, relatedly, what infrastructure is actually optimal also depends a lot on what you're doing it for. You may be a lot more willing to tolerate outages. So if you aren't able to move the CO2 to an underground facility for storage because of some problem with your facility, you might be willing to turn off a direct air capture facility for a couple of months while you fix it. Whereas if this is mitigative on a bunch of power plants and you really need to prevent that CO2 from entering the atmosphere, you probably can't, which suggests that now you need backup and redundant pipeline infrastructure, those kinds of things. And so when we talk about optimizing and projecting and really looking for the infrastructure potentials for a lot of this, really probing that question of what is this serving and what are we actually doing with it, I think is a more important question than it gets credit for sometimes. And then similarly, what policies are actually the most supportive also changes a lot. The policies that we have in place are basically production tax credits for CO2 storage underground, which are not really tied to climate outcomes. That is going to incentivize much, much different behavior. And in this case, maybe because carbon capture is mostly for driving an industry development than something that's really focused on fast climate action. So with all of that, to get into the kind of the way that I think about this, the taxonomy of carbon capture as I think about it, I think there's a few different stages to this. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of semi-complicated animations, and then hopefully we can talk about this a little bit too. But basically, I think the first category and the one that is most common and has been, I think, reasonably the one that has attracted the most opposition, the most concern, is basically carbon capture that's intended to preserve fossil infrastructure, basically in the context of doing mitigation of emissions where there actually are alternatives that don't rely on carbon capture and storage. And I say this in a way that simultaneously recognizes that a lot of the fossil infrastructure preservation types of projects, so keeping the coal fleet running, those types of things, have been fairly problematic. And I don't think they're that well aligned with climate goals, at least in the United States. This is also a bit more morally neutral in some contexts where you think about really potentially important reasons why you might want to enable some fossil infrastructure to keep online. So you're basically making a choice to allow that fossil infrastructure to continue rather than replacing it for some other reason. That might look pretty different, especially in countries that have much newer fossil infrastructure. Maybe not. Like, this is something that I think is worth asking potentially. It's also maybe potentially important in contexts where you have really, really severe health and safety needs or something along those lines that are difficult to meet otherwise, like very, very remote areas, et cetera. So this is not always necessarily something that is definitely a terrible idea, but it's something where I think there's more questions that need to be asked because there are things you could do instead. So instead of putting CCS in a coal plant, retire it and replace it, things like that. The next category, which is also mitigation, is basically carbon capture and storage for mitigation in contexts where there aren't CCS alternatives. Basically, situations where there's not really a possible way of replacing the activity that doesn't involve some CO2 generation. And I'll talk about that in a second. The next category, in my mind, is now carbon dioxide removal that is purposed for offsetting, essentially. So compensatory removals that are dedicated to allowing some emission to go on, but then using removal to offset it to get to this net zero status. And then the last one is basically removals that are purposed for drawdown. So really getting to negative emissions and doing climate restoration. Categorically, these first two are in the mitigation category. So this is all carbon capture, but the function for the first two is mitigation and the function for the second two is removal, but they have very, very different characteristics. So talked about this already a little bit, but in the fossil infrastructure preservation or mitigation with other ways that you could do this that are not CCS based, the categories are kind of fossil-fired power plants, refining, where, again, CCS is a little questionable for some other reasons, but there are some other industrial processes where CCS is an option, but not the only option. one example of this, and again, I'm in Indiana, so this comes up a lot, is in steel, where there are certain and very large ways of making steel that do involve some CO2 emissions, basically because you use metallurgical coal in the process, and that process, which is actually chemically necessary, is also part of the heating elements of this, and so you end up with some CO2 burn off from the met coal. Hypothetically, you could do direct reduction of iron with hydrogen or something along those lines, and a lot of blast furnaces are looking into those alternatives. So it's kind of one of these borderline things where you might install CCS on a steel mill because you are trying to preserve the ability to use met coal there. But hypothetically, you could do something with hydrogen instead, and that might be a maturity question, et cetera. So again, in this sort of fossil infrastructure preservation is not always around just like maximizing profits for the oil industry necessarily. There are definitely those applications too, but this is kind of that category. The next category that I think about is, again, these mitigations where there are not alternatives to CCS that we know of at this point, and this basically addresses non-fossil process emissions. The biggest and most clear example of this is cement, basically because we make Portland cement from calcium carbonate. You're trying to make calcium oxide, which is CaO, from CaCO3. And so when you drive off the CO2 from that calcium carbonate, that's not fossil origin, and it is a necessary byproduct of the cement manufacturing facility process. There are other emissions associated with cement kilns that are fossil-based, and you could think about replacing those fuels, but you are going to retain a fairly significant portion of CO2 emissions that are just associated with the process. This is one that I probably am a little ornery as a civil engineer, and I know we are known for being kind of conservative here. There are emerging alternatives potentially, and one of the most exciting ones, which may move this up into my other bucket, so mitigation where there are alternatives to using CCS, is basically using silicate chemistry rather than carbonate chemistry to make calcium oxide, and there are some breakthroughs there that maybe retain the same chemical properties and would not require retesting and those kinds of things. But until that's ready, there aren't a ton of alternatives to CCS because it's not the case that you can just eliminate cement manufacturing. We don't really have great replacements for cement, that kind of thing, and CO2 is a fundamental byproduct of the process we use. Getting into the removal category, compensatory removal, so this offsetting version, is essentially, again, removing CO2 to compensate for ongoing emissions. So rather than compensating for old emissions from 100 years ago or whatever, this is removing CO2 to compensate for an emission that might be happening simultaneously. And this is, I think, a really significant and interesting political question and policy question. Basically, when some of those compensations are for emissions that could have been eliminated, which I tend to call like a luxury removal, where maybe, you know, I continue to heat my house with natural gas, but I want to use removal to offset that. That's not necessarily a great use of CDR because it does dramatically increase the amount that you have to do. There's questions about how much this is actually really an offset, like you're shifting the burdens of infrastructure and cost and all that sort of thing to different people, et cetera. But hypothetically, you could do a removal on an emission that you could have eliminated, but maybe isn't easy to eliminate. And then there's the category that I think we actually do need to probably prepare to have some CDR in the system, whether that's DAC or otherwise, but basically necessary removals of emissions that could not have been eliminated is the other category here. This is a much smaller collection of things, but just as a little flavor of what that looks like, things like nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture that is already using precision fertilizer application or something like that, where you basically probably need to continue to use fertilizer in order to keep up food production globally, but you are going to have some nitrous oxide emissions associated with that. So there's other things that we could talk about that fall on one side of the boundary or others. There's a lot of debate about what's on either side of this, but basically you are compensating for an emission. How important is it to actually have that emission continue is a real question, and one that I think bears a lot of public deliberation, but that's kind of the function here. And then finally, and this is the one that I also think we probably need to be prepared to talk about in the carbon capture space and ultimately, hopefully have mechanisms to do, is drawdown removals. These are the ones that really do live up to a lot of the hype around CDR potentially, if we could do it, and if we could figure out how to do this in a way that is acceptable in a lot of different contexts. But this is how you reach net negative emissions conditions. there is not a way to reach net negative that does not include removal. There's actually not a way to reach net zero rather than zero without removal either, which is more the compensatory removal side. But once you get into drawdown, you're basically genuinely addressing legacy emissions and potentially starting to restore the climate. So this is the way that you possibly start to bring those temperature increases down. From a climate perspective, you cannot reach drawdown removals until you've already reached zero or net zero emissions globally. That's just like mathematically true. So it's a long way off, but a lot of the technologies are shared and a lot of the potential infrastructure is shared. Like a CDR facility, a direct air capture with storage CDR facility that is purposed for offsetting or purposed for drawdown is going to look pretty much the same. It's really about what we're doing with it. But I think overall the point is a lot of the projects that have actually been proposed are much more around infrastructure preservation and existing infrastructure preservation or mitigation where there actually are alternatives. I would argue that this applies to fossil power plants in the US. I would argue that it applies to ethanol, where you could choose to just stop doing it rather than putting CCS onto it. That's most of the projects that we've actually already talked about, and I think they're the most problematic ones. But kind of wholesale rejecting carbon capture as a technology suite also worries me, not because I think it's super great that we need to do this. I think it is upsetting that we are in a place where some of these things are possibly necessary to reach the climate goals that we have. But in cases where you do need to mitigate emissions and there's really not a whole lot else that we can do other than CCS, and then in the context of being able to actually do permanent removals, there are potentially some opportunities to really probe how we could do carbon capture well and how we could do it in a way that achieves those climate goals. And they're probably a lot smaller. So infrastructure needs and industry scale differ dramatically across these uses, which I think is also a really important point as we think about what it is that we're actually talking about. So basically, if you're talking about only applying CCS in contexts where you don't really have another option, and that includes both the mitigative and removal functions, you're really talking about policies and efforts that minimize CCS rather than maximize it. And I think this figure and a lot of the other rhetoric coming out of the federal government and many of the states kind of emphasizes that the current strategy is basically to try to maximize CCS. That's a big reason why I think we have so many concerns about huge pipeline networks, disinterest in making sure that these things are done very, very safely, less testing than we might want to see in some cases, et cetera. But a lot of the incentives we've set up are around maximization. I think there's a version of the world where we look at minimization and really try to pare this down to applications where we don't see a lot of alternatives to using some of these technologies and apply them very sparingly, recognizing that they're pretty precious and they're able to achieve things that we maybe do want, even at the cost of some infrastructure development. But questions also arise, like I talked about this a little earlier, but you don't necessarily need redundant pipelines if most of what you're doing is direct air capture with storage. If you're only using direct air capture with storage to offset the most important emissions that are hard to eliminate or impossible to eliminate, like these agricultural nitrous oxide emissions after you've done everything you can to get them as low as possible, this is a pretty small industry potentially compared to some of the stuff that we talk about. And so it cuts down the number of facilities, cuts down a lot of the transport question, those types of things. Secondary question there is, do we even need pipelines if we're mostly looking at direct air capture? Again, because you could hypothetically site these co-located with storage and really cut down a lot of the infrastructure that we tend to see people talking about as essentially necessary when they're coupled to other industries. And then my last big point is just that governance is a really core issue for carbon capture development more broadly. And I think the path we're on is not necessarily a great one. So people have already talked about this in this session, but current American approaches incentivize maximizing CO2 storage. It's not something that incentivizes CO2 abatement. It's not something that incentivizes cost minimization. It's really just about trying to maximize CO2 storage. That leads to a lot of perverse incentives, but it's also fixable. And I think one of the things that I say a lot is we are not far enough down the pathway of development and research in these areas that we've really committed to one specific governance approach. We are starting to get to the point where we are locked into a very market-driven, very maximization-driven approach, but This is not a situation where we have, decades of experience with really powerful incumbents. Like, these things are hard to change, but still changeable in a way that's not necessarily true in a lot of more established industries. In general, I think the use of marketized CDR, where you're selling like 1 ton and allowing people to just purchase a ton whenever they want to, really does encourage substitution of mitigation with these removals. So if I say, hey, company, either you can spend a lot of time figuring out how to reduce emissions from your facilities or from your suppliers, or you can just go to this website and buy a bunch of CDR for a price that's maybe a little higher, but is much less of a pain in the ass. This is something that is going to tend to lead people to not be as interested in mitigation. And that also ends up increasing the overall scale of how much CDR you need to do. So if you think about reaching net zero, basically the more positive emissions there are, the more negative emissions you are. So the more mitigation you do, the less removal you have to do to achieve those goals. And then I think the last one is even small systems will be pretty large. Like, we're still probably talking millions of tons, if not billions of tons of CO2 management in the kinds of scenarios where we do as much mitigation as possible, but then also still reach net zero. But it's not actually a foregone conclusion at this point that big incumbent players, and particularly the fossil industry that's starting to get pretty dominant in these spaces, have to manage these systems. Again, we're starting to lock in a few more of these choices, but they haven't fully been made yet. And so with that, carbon capture is a technology category. It solves multiple potential functions. What we use it for matters. And I think there's a lot of different discussion to have about what we're actually doing.